Thank you, Mr. G. All right, good morning, church. Good morning, everyone. It's about that time. I'm happy to see everybody so social and loving with one another. Let's keep that energy, bring it in the class, and then save it for the next time we have a break to talk with one another. I hope everybody's doing all right, and I'm glad to see you here this morning. With that being said, I'd like us to jump right into the class material, right into the text, to just have as much time as we can to talk and learn with one another. I'd like to make this class a little bit more discussional. I hope it goes that way this morning. So that being said, go ahead and take your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 37. And so I want to give us a heads up before we jump into the text. We've been studying through Genesis. We're going to continue in verse 37 today. Transitioning from kind of looking at the life of Jacob specifically to more so looking at the life of his son Joseph. I want us to read through the entire chapter of Genesis 37, and then I'm going to take some time to kind of ask us about some of the major people we see in this text. So I just want to give you a heads up before we get there, before we do that. So as we're reading, you can be thinking about that with each verse that we read and trying to draw out some specifics that you see about the major figures, the major people who are moving this passage through. So Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 1, it says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other brothers, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, listen to this dream that I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you going to reign over us? His brothers asked. Are you really going to rule us? So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Look, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is this that you've had? He said. Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the matter in his mind. Are you staying with me, church? Everybody following along? As we read this next part, I'm going to go ahead and put this map up behind me. Let's see if you can follow along with what the text is saying geographically is going on here. So, continuing on in verse 12, it says, his brothers had gone to pasture his father's flock at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, your brothers, are pasturing the flocks at Shechem. Get ready, I'm sending you to them. I'm ready, Joseph replied. Then Israel said to him, go and see how your brothers and flocks are doing, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from Hebron Valley, and he went to Shechem. And a man found him there, wandering in the field, and he asked him, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. And Joseph said, can you tell me where they're pasturing the flocks? They moved on from here, the man said. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, oh, look, here comes the dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. And he said, let's not take his life. Reuben also had said to them, don't shed blood, throw him into the pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the robe of many colors that he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty and without water. So they sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin going down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. For he is our brother, our own flesh," and his brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" So they took Joseph's robe, they slaughtered a male goat, and they dipped the robe in its blood. They sent the robe of many colors to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?" His father recognized it. "It is my son's robe," he said. "A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." And Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I'm going down to Sheol to my son mourning." And his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guards. All right, so we kind of look at this text as a whole of Joseph and what happens to him, kind of his relationship with his father, his relationship with his brothers. And I want to take some time to kind of just look at every single person that we see in the text here, that we get described a little bit. One thing I want to point out, which I've been trying to do every time we look at a new chapter in Genesis, is the geography that gets talked about in the text. Because normally I just kind of skip over it and don't think much about it when I normally read. But when you actually put it in perspective, it shows some pretty shocking things. For example, we're told that Jacob sends his sons out to shepherd a flock, and he sends Joseph after them. But when he talks to Joseph about it, he kind of speaks in a big way to him. He says, "Get ready. I'm about to send you to do somewhat of a big thing." And Joseph says, "I'm ready." Now remember, Joseph is 17 years old. They start in Hebron Valley, which is right here. All right, but remember, he says that their flock is in Shechem, which is up here. And then when Joseph travels from Hebron to Shechem, he finds a man there, asks him where his brothers went, and they said he went on to Dothan. And so he goes even farther to Dothan. So I don't know if Joseph was by himself. I don't know if he had people to travel with him, but this 17-year-old is going from Hebron all the way up here to even further up here to find his brother. And even with that said, when they sell him to slavery, he's going all the way down there. So we're traveling farther distances than what I normally picture in my mind. Sometimes when I picture this story, I'm thinking, oh, Joseph is going, a couple fields over. No, he's traveling pretty far. And it seems that his father is asking him to do something pretty big in terms of going after his brothers here. So I don't know if that has any significance to anybody else. It stands out hugely to me. With that being said, okay, let's talk about Joseph. What do we learn about Joseph from the text? And even from what we learn about this, is there anything that tells you about Joseph? What do we know about Joseph? Go ahead, Mr. Jim.
He's the youngest, and he's the favorite of his father.
He's almost the youngest. Benjamin may be around at this point, but I mean, yeah, he is pretty young. In terms of all the other brothers that we're dealing with, yeah, he's younger than most all of them. He's 17 at the time. What else do we know? Ms. Denise?
Well, he has a problem because he writes to his brothers about his dreams when they already hate him. So he's not very mature.
Yeah. So as we've been looking at people throughout the text, we've been kind of asking this following question of, okay, what does this person's name mean? And how are they described? And then also, what are their first words? Joseph's words, whatever he seems to say in this passage, is either him giving a bad report about his brothers or him talking about some type of dream. Everything that he says results in his brothers hating him. So yeah, he doesn't seem like Joseph thinks very much about how the words that he says are going to make his brothers feel. It's already a bad situation. Joseph kind of read the room a little bit. Did I see another hand over here? Go ahead.
Well, being 17, I think there lies the problem because his dad puts an awful lot of importance on him.
Right.
And he's only 17, and his brothers who are older resent that. That can cause some friction in the family.
Yeah.
And I can see why he just aggravates him.
Yeah.
And he seems to like it.
That's something that I didn't appreciate about Jacob, right? And I think it's a continued pattern that we see in Genesis, that you have these parents who kind of come along and they see that there's conflict going on in their family, or there's conflict going on specifically amongst their children, and they don't seem to do much about it. Rather, they add to it. Like, who in the first place thought it was a good idea to not only pick out a child as a favorite, but kind of show that off to everyone shamelessly? You know what? We're going to tell everybody by putting a coat of many colors on him. And I think a couple classes ago we talked about how Abraham kind of dealt with Isaac being the child of promise, the one that God brought through Sarah. And there's an importance about that child, but there's still, I think, a smart way or a wise way to deal with that, right? And I think we see that same thing here. Joseph's name means to add, right? God adds. And it's ironic, or it's significant in terms of his story and who he is, because when he goes places, he does seem to add things. You were saying that Jacob kind of puts a lot on Joseph. As he goes throughout the other places in Egypt in his story, we see he goes places and he brings success with him. He knows how to manage. He knows how to be a wise and smart person. And I think even this speaks to Joseph's ability. And maybe that's why he asked him to do it. Is at the age of 17, maybe Jacob thought he could trust Joseph to get all the way up there. And he does. And so even from an early age, that may point to, how skilled or talented, maybe not the most wisest or smartest at the time of a person, but seems like a person who can handle a lot. Go ahead.
In a family, if you think about it, there's always that one that the family seems to not favor, but they trust that one to make the good decisions. And they'll send, I have a sister like that. She's younger than me, but she's definitely more trustworthy.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I think that's something that people can relate to. Sometimes in the family there is an easy go-to, and that's who Joseph becomes, is someone that the family can rely on and trust on. The only other two notes I put down about Joseph is that he's a dream expert. That's what his brothers call him. In some sense, he's an expert in terms of either having a lot of dreams or he can understand dreams pretty well. I also wrote down that he was a snitch or a tattletale. In the sense of, we talked about him bringing a younger sibling, it sticks out that Joseph seems to always be talking about his brothers. Or it seems almost at a point like Jacob expects him to be giving reports on his brother. He sends him to go find out what his brothers are doing, which I think is another bad setup on Jacob's part. Okay. Anything else we can think about? Can we think about Jacob? What do we know about Jacob? We already talked a little bit about the kind of favoritism he shows there, but is there anything else in the text that sticks out to people? If there's one thing, go ahead and share.
I'm wondering, even missed it. Why did his father give him that role?
Because he favored him. I think it's, put simply, I know. The text tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other brothers. And so I can only think that he gave him the coat out of this love that he had for him. It may have been genuine just in the way of saying, oh man, I love my son so much, but I don't think he was thinking very much about how it would make other people feel, considering his other family members and considering his other sons. But I think it's out of that favoritism. Yes, go ahead, Rachel.
He was the son of his favorite wife, too.
Yeah.
So it even goes back a generation that's probably why he favored him, because he was Rachel's son.
Yes, so we talked about that kind of with some of the other people in the past, is that they tend to show this favoritism because there's something great about them. Isaac is the promised child. Abraham gives things to his other sons, but he gives everything to Isaac. Rebekah hears what's going to happen with Jacob, and for that reason, we think she shows all this favoritism towards Jacob. So in that same sense, Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, or the wife that he wanted initially or in the first place. So it makes sense of why he favors Joseph in that way. Okay, another person that gets brought up in the text is Reuben. What do we know about Reuben?
He's the oldest, and he might be the kindest or have a conscience about him.
Right.
That he didn't want his brother killed, even if he might be irritated with him.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I overlooked about the text when I was younger is what Reuben tries to do. no matter how things are going, we seem to learn that he has some intent on saving Joseph. And so out of all the things that are going on, that's probably the most hopeful one or the most uplifting one. It's like, okay, at least we know that at least one of the brothers were against this concept or idea of killing him. Maybe Reuben could have done more immediately, done more abruptly. I mean, he still has this concept or idea of, okay, you can throw him in a pit, but don't kill him with the intent of saving him. Maybe should have acted out more. Maybe if he said more, none of this would have happened in the first place. Does he, any other hands on Reuben?
Well, he did that in the plot to give favoritism of his father.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking. He definitely had the intent of showing this to his father. But I guess it does go back to speak on that kind of rivalry between brothers and that little bit of competition there. In terms of, I mean, Jacob definitely left him lacking or with something to desire there in terms of that favoritism. But it just stuck out to me this time that that's who Reuben is and that's what he's doing. Goes a little bit against the grain from his other brothers. And that probably has to, I think that may have to do with the fact that he's the older brother. Maybe there's a little bit of more wisdom there. Go ahead, Kate.
Another reason that maybe he wouldn't have wanted this to happen was because he's the oldest, he's the firstborn, and he grew up watching his mom and watching the wives with Jacob, and grew up watching all of this favoritism continue, and maybe that was one of the reasons he didn't want to do anything, because he was so used to it at this point that he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. So even if he knew Joseph was a favorite, he'd grown up seeing that with all of the wives, and maybe that was one of the reasons.
Sure. I think that's a possibility. I think it comes along with that wisdom that we're talking about, him being older than the other brothers. Maybe the things that he's seen up to this point, or what could have driven him to do this while his other brothers don't. I do like what you said about the concept of the fact that he is the oldest. There brings along this responsibility that he's supposed to be watching over his other brothers. He has a responsibility towards them. And so that's one thing that I do appreciate about Reuben, is that he does something to that responsibility. Go ahead.
Last thing on Reuben, I think he doesn't want to kill him. That way, if the father says, "Did you kill him?" he can honestly say in his mind, "No."
Right.
Yes, we put him in a pit.
Yeah, right.
But it's kind of covering him.
I guess I can relate to Reuben and to Joseph in both ways. If you talk to my mom, she'll say that I was a person who was ready to tell on someone because I didn't want to get in trouble for anybody. So in that same sense, yeah, Reuben could definitely at least find some defense for himself in the sense of saying, I wasn't the one who was behind selling this child in the slavery, or what happened to him specifically. I don't even know if he can say that, because if Reuben isn't aware of all that happens to Joseph, then all he knows is he didn't act early enough. If he is behind the trick or not, he kind of shows up, and his response is, you know, what have I done? Well, I should have done something sooner. Let me see if I can. Right, in verse 29, it says, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, what am I going to do?" It almost seems like he doesn't know either. And so, in that sense, I guess he doesn't really have a defense for himself. Maybe later, but in the same sense, he should have said something, should have done something earlier is all he can really think. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Well, the text tells us what Reuben's motives were.
Right.
He said that he wanted to put him in the pit so that he could go back later and save him and return him to his father. And then when he went back to the pit so that he could take him out and return him, he was gone.
Right.
Because he had been sold. And then Reuben gets really upset. So I think it's pretty clear that Reuben didn't want Joseph to die. He wanted to save him, if for no other sake than to not grieve his father.
Right.
And then when Joseph wasn't there, you can see his reaction. He tears his clothes and says, "Now what am I going to do?"
Okay, yeah, so a response not in the sense of him not in the sense of him thinking that Joseph has died, but the response he has is to the fact that his plan hasn't come to fruition, and his brother, some harm is coming to him that he was trying to prevent. Good. The only other things I marked down about Reuben is what his name means, behold the son, which is what Leah names him, being the first child that she brings forth to Jacob. He's the oldest. I wrote down that he's the mandrake picker. We get told in some chapters earlier that Rachel and Leah fight over these mandrakes, and Reuben is the child specifically who picked those mandrakes. Go ahead, Ms. Christine.
I feel for Joseph because I'm a younger child,
Mhm.
and I feel like I was kind of the snitch in the family, but I feel like it's like you're putting this is the original story of snitches get stitches. But like, you don't want to, you have integrity, and you don't want to get in trouble. So you want to tell mom and dad, but now you know by doing that, your brothers are going to be mad at you. 'Cause
Right.
you told on them. But it's like, it speaks to his strong character that he still knew he had to do right, even though, and he knew he was the favorite. I mean, he's the only one that got the coat of many colors. I mean, it's all this pressure, like, man, I don't want to tell you guys, but I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah.
And I just feel for him, and it's horrible. He ended up in a ditch, but it's like, he's snitched,
Yeah.
you know? It's just this horrible position he's in.
Yeah, people talk about the Bible as if it's an outdated book. But I think from just our own reading, we can see that there's a lot of things about the text that we can find ourselves easily relating to. But even more than that, there's very simple yet practical applications that we can learn from this text about family and about the family. For the sake of time, I'm going to bring up, the last person I'm going to bring up is Judah, because he's very important as to what we're going to continue to read into. His name means praise. And while Reuben is one of Leah's sons, Judah is also one of Leah's sons. And it's important for us to note and remember that Judah is the one who comes up with the idea of selling Joseph in the first place. While Reuben has this plan to save Joseph, Judah has this plan to make a profit off of Joseph. He says, you know what, let's not kill him like Reuben is saying, but let's sell him into slavery. These brothers remind me of people that we've read prior to this, that we read about previously, being like Cain or Esau. These men who come off as kind of men of the land and come off as a little bit brutish, right? We didn't get to read this last class, but in chapter 34 is the defilement of their sister, or what would have been Reuben and Judah's sister, specifically Dinah. And it's an interesting text because while it seems like Jacob isn't doing enough in that text, we don't see him come to act on Dinah's part, but the brothers do. They come and they kill those who have disrespected their sister. And again, while Jacob doesn't seem like he's doing much in the situation, the brothers are at least doing something, but they're doing way too much. They're overstepping, really. But again, I just want to point out that these brothers' answer to a lot of things seems to just be murder. Okay, this is the issue. What we're going to do is kill this person because of what they've done. And that's exactly how they respond or act in Genesis 37 and verse 18. It says, when they saw him, Joseph, in the distance, before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. Like, I don't even know how that conversation would have gone in their mind. They see him off in the distance and they're like, let's just kill this guy. Like, I can't take him anymore. And someone jumps in and they're like, yeah, I'm on board with that. It's like, what kind of, like, how did this come to, I can't even think about how that conversation would have went. But it's just so second nature to them. It's not hard for them to come to that conclusion. But I just want us to keep note of that, is that for some reason, murder is these men's answer to everything. But this is the family that God chose to make his covenant come through and chose to bring Jesus through. It's a very interesting thing to think about, is that these are the people that God is working through, these people who are murderers. One of the things we brought up that I want to make note of is the fact that there's this building hatred going throughout the text. It talks about how these are brothers, but they're brothers who don't all necessarily have the same mother. So I think they would mentally put some divisions between one another in that sense. The text definitely does. It talks about them, or calls them, sons of Bilhah and sons of Zilpah, right? It talks about the hatred and jealousy they felt towards Joseph. It talks about with every dream that he had, they hated him even more. There's a slow build-up through the text. One of the things that we mentioned before is that Jacob should have been able to see this hatred building up between the brothers and should have done something about this. When reading the text this time around, I thought about Ephesians chapter 6. The text telling children to obey their parents and to honor their father and mother. But verse 4 specifically says for fathers not to stir up their children in anger and to bring them up in training and instruction in the Lord. And we don't see Jacob really do that in this situation. He doesn't really step in to do anything about what's going on with the brothers. With those brothers, with Joseph, with Jacob, I think one mistake that we've been able to point out so far is that they need to be conscious of each other as family. And Jacob doesn't really seem to be conscious of how his actions are making the rest of his family feel. And if he was, it may have prevented this buildup of hatred that we see amongst these brothers. He should have done something to step in there. Okay. Let's move on to chapter 38. So, again, we talked about Judah and that his name means praise. He's one of Leah's sons. He's Jacob's fourth son specifically, and it's his idea to sell Joseph into slavery. I want to remind us of that because as we move from chapter 37 into chapter 38, Jacob becomes kind of, or not Jacob, but Judah becomes kind of a focal point here. So let's continue. In chapter 38, we're going to read the first 5 verses. It says, "At that time Judah left his brothers and settled near Adullam, an Adullamite named Hera. There Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua, and he took her as a wife and slept with her. He conceived and gave birth to a son, and his name was Ur. And he named him Ur. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she gave birth to him." Okay, I'm going to stop us there because one thing I've been trying to encourage us to do as we've been going through the text is looking up what people's name means and seeing if it has any significance in terms of who they are, who their overall story, and what their overall story is. We already pointed that out about Joseph and how his name kind of has significance to his role in Genesis and what he does. With Judah's sons, we see their names do have meaning that we can find or understand. Means to awaken or to be watchful. Onan means strength, and it means power. And while those don't seem to have much significance, I think what sticks out to me in terms of meaning is Sheila's name. It means petition or to give a request. And so it's the only name out of Judah's sons that I see that has significance, or at least it's ironic that that's his name, because this is the son that Tamar comes along later and specifically requests to be with or petitions Judah to marry. So I just thought that was something that stuck out to me, something that I think is kind of interesting there. But let's continue on in verses 6 through 10. It said, "Judah got a wife for Ur, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Now Ur, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, 'Sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and produce offspring for your brother.' But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he released his semen onto the ground. So he would not produce offspring for his brother. What he did was evil in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also." Okay, weird stuff going on in this text. What are immediately some things that we pull from this text, something that stuck out to you, or just an immediate application that you make from this?
The biggest thing to me was the fact that if you produce offspring for your brother, that child is not yours, even though it is.
Yeah, so there's a specific purpose and reason as to what's going on here. We're talking about verse 8 and this Judah talking to his second son Onan. He says it's your duty to do this thing. If we dive deeper into it, we read more about this in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 6 through 10 specifically. It talks about this being the duty of his brother, but why is this a brother-in-law's duty? In verse 6 it says, "The firstborn she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, specifically so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel." So yes, he has a child with his sister-in-law, but it doesn't be considered, that child isn't considered his son, but it's specifically for the purpose that that name isn't blotted out. God specifically wants this person's name to be kept in the line of Israel somehow. So that's the specific purpose for that. It is weird, but we see that God has a purpose in asking people to do this or making this a brother's duty. And this is a big deal. This is like something that's very serious, is what gets pointed out in the text. In verse 9 of Deuteronomy chapter 25, sorry, as I skip some filler slides here, it says, if the brother doesn't, because they have the choice to reject this request. But if they reject this request, we're told in verse 9 that the sister-in-law will go up to him in the sight of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she will declare, "This is what is done to a man who will not build up his brother's house." And so it is a weird process, but it's all things, it's not his child, and he's heavily disrespected if he doesn't do it. But it's all, again, in this responsibility that you have towards your family. And like we're saying, the shame that we kind of see with Joseph, with Jacob, with his brothers, it's supposed to be a consideration for your family. And so there's a lot of disgrace or kind of disrespect that gets put on them when they say, my own family? No, I don't care. It's not my problem. I don't want to be involved with all of that. And that's exactly what Onan does. Not only do we see that for the elders or the tradition or the law of the Israelites, not only is it a big deal to them, but it's especially a big deal to God. Because God sees what Onan does, and he recognizes it as an evil thing. He said, you have done something that is evil. The thing that stuck out to me about this practice that we see in the text is James chapter 1. It talks about pure and undefiled religion before God. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Again, it's God moving or motivating people to look out for those around them and consider those around them. Not only your family, but the other people who don't have anything to give to you, being widows and orphans. That's, from as early as Genesis, we can see is God's thing, taking care of widows, taking care of orphans. The only other thing that stuck out to me in this passage, besides that, is God's response to her first husband. Right? I think oftentimes when we think about God bringing judgment on the wicked, sometimes we assume, or our first thought is that that's only going to be on Judgment Day, when Jesus comes back. I think this text tells us that God doesn't always just judge people as late as Judgment Day. He steps in and he intervenes in terms of the life of because he's such a bad guy. God steps in and he says, this guy is so bad, I'm going to execute him myself. And I think that's always should be a comfort to the righteous, or to those who find refuge in God, in the sense that God brings judgment on those who oppress those who do good or those who do wickedness. So I'd hope as we read that although that sounds kind of intense, it should bring us comfort in some sense. On the other hand, it could be a warning to us, understanding that if we find ourselves being just as wicked as someone like that same judgment can fall down upon us. Go ahead, Ms. Christine.
Oh, wait, do we know if the woman had, if the wife had a choice? Like, if her husband died, like, would she be considered sinful if, because it says in Deuteronomy, you had that verse that said the firstborn son. Does that mean always her firstborn son has to be part of that family? Or could she have chosen to have, because she was a widow, be free from that family, remarry, and have another firstborn son with someone else? Or is that a choice?
So, do you have an answer to that? Go ahead.
According to Scripture, because it's a kinsman redeemer, it's their law.
Okay.
And it's their tradition to save the next generations.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, given the example with Ruth and Boaz, she was a widow and her family had passed away, all the men, and went to the next of kin for her protection.
Right.
And then for the lineage to continue.
Right.
In the right form as with the family.
Right.
The chosen people.
So yeah, that's the immediate place where my mind went first in terms of I hope everybody heard that. Ms. Christine was wondering if there's any possibility for a woman to choose something else for herself in terms of who she marries or how this whole process works. And I think Ruth is the perfect example, or the immediate response to that, right? There is a person that Boaz goes to try to get permission to marry Ruth from in the first place, who by law is the person that Ruth is supposed to probably go to first. And so I think it tells us that there are other ways that they could have gone about it. There's supposed to be a civil kind of discussion and agreement there. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Let's continue on in the text. Let's look at something crazy in verse 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, once and Onan dies, Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he might die too like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's land. Okay, what's the problem here?
Sheila is still a child,
Right.
too young to marry.
Right. Yeah, so Judah comes to Tamar and he says, okay, when Shelah gets old enough, you can be married to him since you need a husband. But the issue that sticks out to me here is what Judah says about Shelah. I think the text tells us that he fully has no intent on Tamar marrying him. And he even goes as far as just saying something weird to me. He says, okay, maybe he's just going to die like his other brothers. Like, who says that? It's like, well, all right. It seems that Judah has some type of expectation for Shelah to possibly end up like his brother. He says, I'll promise him to Tamar, but maybe he's going to die like his brother, so he doesn't have to marry her. It's a weird thought process for a father to have about his child. Judah is an interesting dude. I want us to be able to pull that from the text. Anything else anybody sees or sticks out to them there? Go ahead, Kaylee.
Overall, like Christina's saying, does the woman have a choice? All of it is so foreign to our traditions and our culture and how we do things, because Tamar's father is still living. If my husband were to die, I would go to my parents.
Right.
That's like my logical reaction is I would go back to my dad and have my dad help take care of me and my children.
Right.
But this culture, she completely belongs to his family, and
Yep.
it's his family's responsibility, and it's hard to wrap our minds around that because that's so different from our culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great thing to point out is kind of the cultural shock or the cultural difference that we see in the text. In our own time, yeah, there may have been more of an expectation for her family at some point to take care of her. But it's not really here. He, again, kind of thinks, okay, she's with that family. That's now their responsibility. And that may even speak again to what we've been saying thus far about family not considering each other as much as they should, right? And that there may still be a responsibility there or there is still a responsibility there that her family should feel some need or some desire to take care of her in that sense. My mind gets taken to the analogy of Americans traveling to different places, not being conscious of the culture differences and not looking into that before going there. Showing up with your fanny pack and your super white shoes. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that when looking at the biblical text, right? We can find ourselves tripping up ourselves or coming along in a mistake when we come into the text just assuming that that culture is exactly like ours. But it's really interesting to think that the more we learn about their culture, there's more that we learn about God and His will and His covenant. It's very interesting. Okay, let's continue on in verse 12. It says, and after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died when Judah had finished mourning. He and his friend Hera the Adulamite went up to Timnah to his sheep shears. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's clothing, veiled her face, covered herself, and sat at the entrance of Enam, which is on the way to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. And when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So he went over and said to her, come, let me sleep with you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me for sleeping with me? He said, I will send you a young goat from my flock, he replied. But she said, only if you leave something with me until you send it. What should I give you? He asked. She answered, your signet ring, your cord, and staff in your hand. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. So she got up and she left, and then removed her veil and put her widow's clothes back on. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite, in order to get back to the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where's the cult prostitute who is beside the road at Enam? There has been no cult prostitute here, they answered. So the Adulamite returned to Judah, saying, I couldn't find her. Besides, the men of the place said, there's been no cult prostitute here. And Judah replied, let her keep the items for herself, otherwise we will become a laughingstock. And after all, I did send this young goat, but you couldn't find her. Okay, what do we learn about Judah from this text? What's his pastime? What is something that he seems like, he doesn't bat an eye at doing? He sleeps with prostitutes. If he hasn't done it before, even in this one act now, he doesn't really bat an eye about it. He sees a woman veiled, and he sees an opportunity, and he goes for it. Okay, he leaves his signet with her, his staff, and his cord. What's the significance of that?
It was left as a pledge that they would bring that goat and whatever that he promised her.
Yeah, and I think another thing that is, obviously Tamar is smart in terms of her dealings and what she's doing here, because the equivalent of this signet and of this cord and of this ride today would be my driver's license, or my birth certificate, or my signature, or a picture that said, hey, Roy was here. There's nothing, I think the one thing I want to point out about this situation is that Tamar is definitely smart in terms of asking what she asked for from Judah, because there's nothing that probably could have been more directly pointing towards Judah than what she asked for here, this signet ring. It is like his seal. It marks him as him. It's the best form of identification she could have gotten about him or from him. let's see here. Okay, yeah, he's a man who casually sleeps with prostitutes, and we see that he leaves the thing that identifies him the most with Tamar. Okay, the other thing I wanted to point out is that Judah seemed to be pretty okay with giving up these important things. These are really important. It'd be the same thing as someone saying, just leave your ID with me, and you go, okay. It doesn't seem like he thinks very much or thinks twice about giving up those things, and it doesn't seem like he thinks very much in terms of them being left with her. But with us running out of time, let's continue on and finish up the chapter, starting in verse 24. So about 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has been acting like a prostitute and now is pregnant. Bring her out, Judah said, and let her be burned to death. And as she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message. I am pregnant by the man whom these items belong. And she added, examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I am, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her intimately again. So the time came for her to give birth. There were twins in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread around it, announcing, this one came out first. Then she pulled his hand back. Then he pulled his hand back, and out came his brother. And she said, what a breakout you have made for yourself. So she named him Perez. And his brother, who had the scarlet thread tied around his hand, came out, and his name was Zerah. So there's some interesting things going on in the text here. I think we easily see more things that kind of tell us the character of Judah. You see huge hypocrisy on his part in the sense of him saying, okay, he's heard that Tamar is acting like a prostitute, and he says she's worthy of death. She should be burned at the stake. And the irony of that is that while he's saying it's okay for Tamar to be burned as a prostitute, he's someone who casually sleeps with prostitutes, which says he's liable to be burned himself, or that's something he's deserving of in that sense. But we see that because of Tamar's thinking and because of Tamar's plan, Judah kind of gets ousted in terms of the person that he is. And the laugh stock that he's trying to prevent himself from being in the first place is the exact place that he ends up. The other thing I want us to notice about what Judah does and what he says is simply verse 26. He says, she is more in the right than I am, since I did not give her my son Shelah, and he did not know her intimately again. So we see that Judah knows that he's wrong, and he declares the exact reason that Tamar did what she did. It means everything that Tamar is thinking, it's no surprise to Judah. He knows exactly what he did and why he did it. Specifically, he says, she is more right than I am. Some translations translate that as saying she is more righteous than I am. So out of all the things that we see Judah do, and out of the flaws that we see in his character, this is one thing that stuck out to me and that I appreciate about him. It may even be the start of a change that we see in him. Because it's one thing to apologize to a person, and it's another thing to admit you're wrong. But I think it's a whole other thing to admit that someone is more righteous than you are. A lot of things are easier said than done. Admitting your own faults and admitting you're wrong against someone that you disagree with is a very difficult thing. I don't know if I could ever bring myself to say that another person in that context is more righteous than I am when they've just made a huge fool out of me. But it seems that Judah learns a genuine lesson from what happens here. So all in all, kind of summing up Judah and what we've seen about it from the text, he makes a promise to Tamar that he fully doesn't intend to keep. He leads his brothers in selling Joseph into slavery. He raises 2 sons who are so evil that God feels a need to step in and execute them himself. He's a man who casually sleeps with prostitutes, and he's hypocritical in terms of trying to kill his daughter-in-law who he slept with. Right, so I want to draw our attention again to the fact that this is the man that God brings his covenant through, and the man who which Jesus one day comes. Kings come from Judah. And so not only does this passage emphasize the responsibility that family has towards one another, but it also demonstrates how much good God is still able to do with the worst. Judah is a pretty bad guy, but we see that God speaks to his name El Shaddai by doing the thing that's impossible. There are a lot of difficult things that we see God accomplish, and one of them is just changing really bad people. And we see that he starts to change Judah. This may be the start of a new Judah that we see, and one that is important in terms of what happens next in Joseph's life, speaking to our overall theme of how we got here. All right, so we're going to move from Joseph to Judah back to Joseph next week. In preparation for that, we'll be reading chapters 39 to chapter 41, verse 45 specifically. 39 to 41 and verse 45. I hope this has been edifying to all of you. I've had an amazing time discussing this topic with one another. Thank you for your time and thank you for your ears.
Totally.